So for our next panel/fireside chat, we are very fortunate to have one of the premier, we have all premier moderators today from Politico, who is our media partner. But today we have Camille von Kaenel, who covers energy, climate, environmental issues, and more with Politico. And then we have a very special guest with whom I get to serve on a nonprofit board, and that's Liane Randolph, who is most recently the former chair of the California Air Resources Board, has also been a commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission. Boy, I had to remember those abbreviations. And what a time to talk about our climate goals, their effect on our fiscal health, environmental health, our financial health, as well as the impact of energy, and basically anything else. And what a time to talk to someone who's a recent former, so may or may not have a little bit more leeway. And with that, please warmly welcome Camille and Liane. Thank you.
All right. Is this working?
All good.
Okay. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, Liane, I'm hoping that you'll be a little more frank and open as a former here. So, you know, I'm a journalist. I can't resist the news. So I figured we would start with some news and then go into some general topics, and then there will be a Q&A portion at the end. So get those ready. So, you know, top of mind for me right now is the governor's race and what happens in a post-Newsom chapter. So I was thinking, you know, if you were to advise the next governor on how to balance climate goals and affordability concerns that have popped up so much recently, what would you tell him?
That is a great question. I guess I would say a couple things. First of all, I think since I left my most recent position, obviously I've been thinking a lot about sort of what's next in our climate work, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the federal government and how to fight the federal government. And so when I was, still in the position, it was very much in the warfare in the trenches. But when you have a chance to step back and think about where we are as a state, I think one of the key challenges is linking our climate goals and the benefit of those climate goals to individuals, right? If you think about the air quality work that CARB has done over the years, there is a very clear transition from the cloudy, eye-watering skies of Los Angeles to the much cleaner air we have now. And people can kind of see those benefits. And people sometimes forget, and I think those of us in the room who are a little older need to remind the younger generation that, no, when we were kids, this is what would happen when there was a smog alert, and this is what we would do, and that's what that was like. And don't take that for granted, because it's a real thing. So when you think about climate, a lot of what we talk about is, we are world leaders, and we are driving innovation, and we are driving investment. All of those things are true, but there's not a connection to the individual. And I think that's kind of an important next step. As Catherine mentioned, she and I serve on the board of California Forward, which is a nonprofit that thinks a lot about these issues, thinks a lot about, how can we link the climate policies and the climate investments to people's lives, people's jobs, and people's opportunity in the state. If I were advising the governor, I would be sort of sitting down and thinking about, okay, what are some ways we can connect those dots that don't necessarily involve directly spending money, because we know resources are always limited, but how can we link those things?
So it sounds like a messaging effort here.
It's partly messaging, and then it's also partly policy, right? And I'll give you an example of some of the advocacy, both when I was at the PUC and at CARB, is is, we would get requests on, I'll give you one example, are, workforce standards. Can you please impose more standards on a particular type of project? And our response would always be, oh, well, that will add cost to the project, so not sure that's the right policy. I think there's an opportunity to kind of say, actually, maybe we need to think more expansively about that. And so, what are the policy ways that the climate policy and goals can strengthen job creation and strengthen the quality of jobs? So that's just one sort of example of opportunities. Another example is climate resilience. Individuals are feeling the impacts of high heat. Individuals are feeling the impacts of wildfire smoke and of losing their homes. So what are policy levers that we can pull that ameliorate those impacts on a consistent basis? Things like a few years ago there was legislation on cooling centers, things like that. Like, have opportunities like that we fund and implement in a sustained way, and people can actually feel the benefit of the climate work that we're doing. Knowing, yes, in the back of their heads, yes, this is an international challenge, and we know we are providing international benefits, but we're also providing benefits to individuals in the communities that are dealing with climate impacts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then on policy, one thing that Becerra has said so far is he's not sure he wants to commit to California's zero-emission vehicle sales target, regardless of what happens at the federal level, because that's a different story. You were essential to that process. Is it the right move to refine that target now, given these affordability concerns? Is it going to mess up the manufacturers' plans? What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant because
Great.
I will say that when the federal administration changed, I think that we thought that the manufacturers would respond and take that opportunity to kind of try to weaken the standards. I did not know they were going to go for a full-on jailbreak and just be like, we are going to lean in and do everything we possibly can to try to destroy California's authority. That was a bit of a surprise. And so I think what comes next is a couple things. First, thinking about, okay, now we have actually been set back, right? With the Congressional Review Act action against ACC2 and against the heavy-duty rules, we are behind where we were before. So the question is, how do we think about what to do next? And CARB is starting that process with their Drive Forward pre-rulemaking activity, and I think there's going to be an important public discussion about that. So I think that's important. One of the other things that Becerra said was, keeping an eye on affordability, thinking about how do we make sure that there are opportunities for individuals at all economic levels to get electric vehicles. I think if I were sitting down with him, I would tell him all the different ways that we do have opportunities for lower income folks to get less expensive vehicles. And it's going to be an important policy step to continue those efforts. But it's hard to do it without the manufacturers, right? Because the manufacturers need to be not only producing lower cost vehicles, they need to be marketing those vehicles. And you see, for instance, GM did a new Chevy Bolt, which was great, but when's the last time you saw a Chevy Bolt commercial, right? Like, don't just build it. Sell it. Y'all know how to do it. Sell it. Now I've completely lost my train of thought. Other than to just say that, to me, the whether or not, either CARB or the next governor choose to tweak the structure of the vehicle regulations, the important thing is to keep going, to keep pushing forward, and to keep the structure in place so that the industry does not get completely left behind by the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, so I heard a similar message recently. This panel is well-timed because lots of stuff has been happening, which is I heard a similar message when CARB changed its cap and invest rules recently, a couple weeks ago, to basically give some relief to refineries. That was one of the main reasons. The implications are still a little bit unclear, but it could reduce revenues for a lot of climate projects. Was that the right move to change cap and invest rules at this point? What do you think?
So it wasn't just refineries. The reallocation of the allowances, first of all, really does significantly continue California's ambition. The original trajectory from now to 2030 was a 4% decrease in the cap. It is now an 11% decrease in the cap, right? That's not small, right? The program is still pushing forward. And given the challenges around, some of the things that were discussed in the earlier presentation, around diesel prices, fertilizer prices, gasoline prices, all of those things are putting pressure on manufacturing facilities and cap and trade covered entities. And so just sort of trying to ignore those impacts, I think is not prudent. And so I think what CARB was trying to do was to continue moving forward, but as with vehicles, you have to continue making progress even if you're tweaking how the progress is made. And I'll just do one little editorial comment, which is the the MDI program to provide allowances for facilities to take early action to decarbonize their manufacturing, I think is a huge opportunity. And I feel like the debate, it got conflated with the debate about reduced GGRF revenue. But the reality is that sort of asking a company to make early capital investments in an era where you're not going to have any grant help from the federal government, I think it was sort of an interesting, creative way to think about, okay, how can we encourage companies to move faster? And they structured it in such a way, it used allowances that they had already slated for removal from the program. So it didn't directly affect GGRF. And I think I am hoping that actually projects will happen as a result of that program. And there's a lot of sort of process challenges, and I'm sure there's a lot of folks in this room who can give me a long list of reasons why just doing any project is challenging. But I just really hope that there is an opportunity for companies who are in sectors where decarbonization strategies are, not necessarily growing on trees. What are some things that program can help add to the stack of capital and funding that will be used for decarbonization projects?
Mm-hmm. To me, this overhaul, and maybe we're in the details here, but I just want to emphasize this is a really important overhaul of California's signature climate policy, responding to affordability concerns. So it's like right on theme, which is why I'm glad that we're talking about it here. To me, it put into question what CARB's role is in this day and age, like whether it's to reduce emissions primarily, whether it's to pass industrial policy, whether it's to make electric bills cheaper for folks. And I wonder what you think CARB's role is now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would argue that over the decades, CARB has always had to balance those things and has always had to figure out how to make progress on air quality or climate. I mean, it's in the statute, right? That CARB has to balance economic impacts with the emissions reduction policy. And over the years, programs like cap and trade, like the low carbon fuel standard, have always tried to have that balance. And the vehicle standards, have when CARB first started doing zero emission vehicle regulation and targets, it was always with an eye toward what is technologically feasible, what is something that can be accomplished, and here's how the standards are structured in a way to accomplish that. And there's always been debates about you're not moving fast enough, you're not moving far enough, and oh my God, you're going to break the economy. And they've had to strike that balance over and over again, and I think they're still doing that.
Okay, so all of the above, easy task.
Right. I mean, that's been, when you think about actions to phase out harmful pollutants and things like that, it's never okay, you have to do this tomorrow. It's always been with a recognition that it's going to take time. And I think that continues.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then, both these things that we're talking about, the vehicle stuff and the cap and invest changes, make me think more broadly also about what California's role is. Like, so long, California's brand has been, we're able to reduce emissions while growing our economy. It kind of seems like we're entering a different phase now. So I want to hear from you, like, is California still this beacon of possibility and hope for that balance, or should we rethink it?
I think California is. I mean, there are conversations worldwide where governments are talking about, do we need to rethink our climate targets? I look at the state of New York, which passed a cap and trade package of legislation and have not implemented it. So the fact that we are continuing, that the legislature reauthorized our signature program, that we're continuing to implement it with changes, to me means the consistency that we have had over 3 governors continues. The structure of it may be different. The pieces of it may change. But ultimately, the idea that this is not optional continues.
Mm-hmm. Well, we were talking a little bit backstage about how you're thinking about how things should go on the federal level too, and I think it ties in because we're talking about, does California even still have a role? Like, how much can California do by itself going forward? And so I wanted to hear your vision for what the federal level should be doing on vehicles, and then if you can articulate, like, is California still even a player in those discussions going forward?
Yeah, people ask me all the time, sort of like, is the Clean Air Act still alive? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. The Clean Air Act, the basic structure of the Clean Air Act is the same. Yes, Congress did what we think was an illegal action in repealing 3 of the waivers the US EPA gave us to implement our rules. But that's not a structural change. That was a political action. And we think there are reasons why that was not a legal political action, and so the state has filed litigation. But the real question is kind of what comes next. Clean Air Act is still there. It's really important that the idea of regulatory certainty and a clear path needs to sort of come back to the forefront. And so I co-wrote an essay with a former CARB person, Craig Siegel, and a representative from the United Auto Workers Foundation, and then a person from the Federation of American Scientists in DC, about sort of how we think about what comes next at the federal level. To me, it would be a really good opportunity to think about nationally where the vehicle standards should go, and what are some of the policies that this federal administration has pulled back from that really should continue. So the idea of thinking about vehicle standards not just in the abstract, but in a way that is cognizant of what's going on in the world around us and what other countries and companies in those countries are doing. Thinking about battery manufacturing, thinking about more vehicle manufacturing in the US, thinking about the raw materials that go into all of that and what are the opportunities for California and other states to have manufacturing of the different pieces of the supply chain. How do we think about folding in job creation into the policy generally? So it's not just about the standards, it's about the things that go with it. And that's really what the Biden administration was trying to do. And I think, again, when the new federal administration came in, I think there was a sort of an initial belief of, well, they're going to keep some of these policies in place just because they make sense. Having battery factories in the US makes sense. And so there was a moment of like, are they really pulling back on this? Are they really doing this? And I believe, based on what's happened over the last 2 years, is there's going to be a lot of folks in 2029 who were like, oh, I never really supported that. And so I think there's an opportunity to reach across the aisle and find some of those more moderate voices at the national level who do recognize that having a larger comprehensive industrial policy makes a lot of sense, and being cognizant of the competition from the rest of the world makes a lot of sense, and building a kind of federal package of legislation that does those pieces in a comprehensive way that can ideally get some bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then I guess speaking of industrial policy, California is not necessarily an auto manufacturing hub compared to other states, not necessarily a hub for data centers or other manufacturers that have issues with California policies, like climate policies. Can California be a player on those national conversations, or how do you address the industry in California?
Yeah, I think I am realistic that those policies aren't necessarily going to provide a wave of new manufacturing of auto parts in California. But at the same time, California's manufacturing sector is the largest in the country. It is so critical. And building on the success of the manufacturing we have here in California and being supportive of new manufacturing as much as possible is absolutely consistent with California policy, and it can present opportunities. So, I don't know what that looks like because I'm not an expert in kind of those opportunities. And obviously we saw some of that conversation around Lithium Valley, and that hasn't quite had the promise that we had hoped. But as a state being really open to that, and thinking about ways to ensure the state continues to be open to that. Like an example is, the debate over the definition of advanced manufacturing in the CEQA exemption, and I just really don't want debates like that to make it seem like we aren't, as a state, supportive of those new opportunities, and there have been a couple companies who have taken advantage of that opportunity for that exemption. And the reality is that exemption alone is not going to bring a facility to California that we don't have already, but it shows, it's like putting out a welcome map and saying, yeah, we do want to have opportunities like that. And I just think it's an important piece of the discussion that as we're thinking about national standards, are there opportunities for California to participate in that? But I don't want us to give up on strong vehicle standards. California still has a leadership role under the Clean Air Act, but we also know that if it's just California by itself, it's not as durable. So to the extent we can have robust federal policy that moves toward cleaner vehicles in a comprehensive way, that is ultimately going to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we've talked about manufacturers. I want to bring in consumers as well. Specifically, I've been thinking a lot about this with the GGRF discussion and how, GGRF was a way for stringent climate policies to be politically appealing to a broader coalition, and that's starting to erode now. So I wonder, how do you sell climate standards to a broader coalition of consumer, like electricity consumers, everyday consumers, and communities when you don't have that incentive on the back end?
Yeah, I think that kind of circles back to our first part of the conversation, which is figuring out how to link climate policy to individual benefits that can't just rely on, okay, you're going to get this goodie. Because GGRF is structurally intended to reduce over time. And the benefits of having energy production nearby that's not emitting, that's a good benefit, full stop. So, having a gas plant either not exist or run much less, which is pretty much what our gas fleet now is being used for, right? It exists, it needs to be maintained at a certain level, but it will run a lot less. And then having cleaner energy nearby, that's a benefit. And how do we sort of continue to link those benefits? Another example is cleaner heavy-duty trucks. And one of the identified community benefits to the cap and trade program was the fact that it funded cleaner trucks in impacted communities that had a measurable benefit. So, and the low carbon fuel standard as well. And so I think linking those benefits is a way to help maintain that support.
I gotta turn the microphone on for it to work. Okay, we have time for one more question from you, Camille, if you like, and then we'll go to the audience for one or two as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, as a former, is there anything looking back on your experience in government that you would have done differently, given where this conversation has gone?
Okay. So I guess one example is when we did the light-duty vehicle standards, the requirement is increasing percentages of zero-emission vehicles. And the definition of zero emission is all electric, hydrogen, and plug-in hybrid. We didn't talk very much about plug-in hybrids, and I really regret that, because every time people talk about it, they talk about it as a gas ban. And it's like, including a publication that starts with a P and ends with an O, a gas ban. And it's like, no, it's not a ban. It's it's an increasing percentage of cleaner vehicles that includes plug-in hybrids. And I feel like, the people who pull boats around, like, if in their head they had like, oh, and I would have to have a plug-in hybrid, maybe it would be a little easier to kind of have people see themselves in the program and see themselves in the target. So I will say I wish I had been more vocal about the plug-in hybrids.
Okay. Well, thanks for having an answer.
Oh, that's good. I appreciate that. Okay, questions from the audience? Yeah, all right, I'm going to try. I'm coming around. I usually start on this room, so I fooled you, didn't I? Okay, sneak behind you here. Okay.
Hi, I'm Miss Wilson from Best Health and Wellness, and I'm just glad to see you're not teary-eyed from retiring the last time I saw you, but I'm glad for carbs. As a person who grew up in Southern California, I'm not going to give my age away, but I used to fly from Sacramento and go back home for the summer, and you can see the smog flying into LA. So it's gotten better. You can still see it, but it's not as gray and black as it used to be. My question is, I received an email from the UAE embassy in Washington, D.C., and they were talking about taking the Port of Oakland and doing coal out of it. And so how is that going to affect CARB's ability to monitor the air quality for that? I don't know if you can answer that now that you're retired.
Okay, got it.
Yes, I am very familiar with that. I actually live in Oakland, and it has been a multi-year saga in Oakland. And I guess I will say, I think, there still will be, the local air district has to do, is going to do its thing in terms of monitoring what's going on. And I am hoping that sort of the port will be responsible, and that the air district will help track how things are happening to make sure that whatever happens is done with as many environmental protections as possible. But I know, people living near the Port of Oakland have been dealing with truck traffic and ship traffic for years, and I do think it is causing quite a lot of community concern. But there has been many years of litigation over that have basically said, it can proceed. Coal shipments can proceed. So I'm just hoping that the port and the air district will really keep as close an eye on how it's playing out as possible.
All right, where did I see? I see Jim. I'm coming to you. Man, you're right in the middle of the room. Okay.
Thank you, Catherine. Two questions. One is UC was very involved in the hydrogen strategy, in the hydrogen hub, and working with the state to win the hub. Now they're clawing it back. The feds are. What's a path forward on hydrogen? That's one question. And then the second question is, you talked about the need for people to feel the benefits of our climate strategy and the clean air and that sort of thing. But a lot of the cap and trade program, we pay people, for example, in other states to make reductions, right? Like the geothermal we're adding to the grid in California is coming from Utah. So those are hard hat jobs in Utah, not California. So I'm wondering if you could comment on both of those.
You get to pick one, and if there's time to answer both, we'll do that.
Well, I'll start with hydrogen because I think that is an important conversation. And when they pulled back on the hydrogen hub, like that was another example of like, yeah, they're probably going to do crazy shit, but they're not going to stop hydrogen support, and they did. So I do know that there's a lot of interest in producing hydrogen for heavy-duty vehicles, particularly in South Coast, which has their indirect source rule. So I have talked to folks who are continuing projects that they had in the queue, recognizing that the hub money is not going to come because they still see a market for it and they still see an opportunity for it. So I think some of that will still continue. I think it's not going to be as much as we had hoped, which, again, is so self-defeating and unfortunate.
You want to try that cap and trade question he had as well, just because I answer that one?
It's a fair question. Folks ask it all the time. And, it's a complex question because we're a state, not a country. So we have obligations under the Constitution for how we run programs as a state, not a separate country. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us in California is we have this sustained policy leadership, but we don't get to do it all by ourselves. We have to do it in a way that's consistent with the Constitution, and we have to do it in a way that recognizes that we do not want the emissions to just pick up and leave the state. And a lot of the conversation around the most recent cap and invest amendments were about what we call leakage and, what are the ways that we can make sure that the manufacturing we have in California stays and that there is an opportunity to grow manufacturing. And so I think those two issues of how our programs end up being used by people out of state and how we prevent leakage are just parts of the program we have to deal with, and we have to recognize that there's trade-offs to those policies. And if we want to have the program at all, we need to be thinking about how to address those two issues.
Thank you. Liane, it's been wonderful. I hope we will have you at the center of many, many times. Free plug for us. Camille, thanks for the great questions. Thank our panelists, please. We will have Lance Hastings from Manufacturers Association here in our very next panel. We have 5 minutes. Take a nice human break, get up and stretch, and we'll see you for our capping out panel in just 5 minutes. Thank you.